Okay, so we get into some heavy-duty fiscal policy today, talking about G's and T's. And before we go there, I wanted to make sure you had in your notes the summary of what we did with the voting deal last time. So I want to put that model down for you. So what we did was we had some. I guess the question we were looking at is do we get efficient and equitable solutions from democracy? And the voting model that we had a distribution of goods that started off with 10 people each having 2 of our bracelets. So, and obviously the goods could be anything. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I started everybody off with 2 bracelets and went through a series of majority rule votes where we did have some restrictions on what you had to do. So our voting assumptions of the model was to vote yes if you get more in terms of the redistribution questions that we did. Number 2, we just abstain if you have no change. So kind of our rational ignorance part there. If you've got no dog in the hunt, then you don't bother voting. And number 3, of course, you're against if you lose. So vote no if you get less with the new distribution. And then the other part of it was that I was the agenda setter, so I kind of had I wielded a little bit of power in what got brought to vote. And so the first thing we brought to vote was an alternative distribution of goods in society that, and I don't know if I perfectly mirrored this, so what if we did 4, 4, 3, 3, 3, let's see, how many 3s do I got here? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 0, 0, 0. I'll let you catch up, get that written down. So here was the status quo. And then I, as the agenda setter, said, suppose we consider this alternative distribution for society. 4, 4, 3, 3, 3. All those in favor say aye, right? All of these people following our voting assumptions got more. These people got less. Motion carries. Through democracy, D2 is adopted. And now we change to D2. Okay, anybody questions on that on the setup? All right, well then we just keep going down. So D3, we have another alternative. Suppose we do 6, 5, 5, 4, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. 6, 5, 5, 4. All those in favor say aye, 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 aye. All those opposed, and now here there's only 2 opposed because these people are abstaining because there was no change, right? And so motion carries, D3 is adopted through majority rule in our democracy. All right, then we can do it again, and we just keep going through these motions. Suppose this one now is 6, 7, 7, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. We'll just keep these all zeros. Again, motion carries 2 to 1 this time. I kept the 6 the same. Distribution 5. suppose we say 10-10, we're down to 2 people, 0, and then the rest zeros. All those in favor say aye. Motion carries 2-1 through majority rule. We adopt D5. And then here's the clincher where it gets real ugly, right? The last D6, suppose we put up to vote 19, 0, 1, 0, and the unthinkable thing happens where in a democracy, through a series of votes, we were able to have one person with just about everything and everyone else nothing or close to nothing through a series of majority rule votes. And so the purpose of that exercise is to kind of call to our attention that just because you got a democracy doesn't mean that you're always going to get the desired results that you think you might get just based on majority rule alone, even though we have the perception of, well, maybe that's the fair way to come to decisions. If we don't have the proper ingredients in place of everybody participating and everybody caring about the system, then we could lead to some ugly results too. Okay? Questions or comments there?
Did you see the recent study they did about what America has right now as far as democracy?
No.
A professor from Stanford and Northwestern did a study, and they've basically claimed that we no longer have a democracy and more have an oligarchy. They say it's more of whoever has, in political or financial power,
yes,
has all of the votes.
So one thing I brought up in class, so what Chris was bringing up is there was a research paper fairly recently, and they were claiming that we don't really have a democracy even anymore, and they're really playing along lines like this, that our system in the United States is more about cronyism, which is a term that I've brought up before, of who you know and who you're connected with plays more of an important role as opposed to what the best alternative is. And that's with this pork barreling and other stuff that gets into the political process. And so these people claimed it to be more of an oligarchy, which is kind of ruling by a few people, those people who are well connected, those people with wealth to influence the political process, blah, 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 blah. So economists kind of tend to throw that into this category of cronyism, and it is one of the most destructive things to capitalism. So capitalism with free voluntary actions ends up being a method to get goods and services produced and allocated. And when people chum up with each other, they end up being disruptive to that process. And it can cause lots of inefficiencies and lots of inequality for that matter. Same thing. Okay, good. Any other comments or questions? All right, so I thought that was a good lead-in to thinking about this last chapter of ours, chapter 13 on fiscal policy. And what I want to start off with is putting some meat on the G and the T. So far this semester we've pretty much talked about the government budget as T minus G. So we spent some time in one of the chapters thinking about national savings and how investments created. So in our capital account, we have people who are saving their own money, and if they put it into some financial institution, it ultimately gets loaned out to somebody who needs the funds to do hopefully something productive, whether that's a business buying a new machine or a new computer or investing in a building or whatever it is, that it's adding to the resource base. And so that's a pretty powerful concept. And when the government ran a deficit, that caused interest rates to go up or down. When the government ran a deficit, what was the effect on interest rates? So they enter the funds market. Do they go up or down? Let's think about this here. This is where we got to kind of have our thinking caps on, and I know Some of you aren't quite as comfortable on doing stuff like this that I am, but now you start to see the framework of why it's helpful. Hopefully it'll help you work through something that can be kind of complex, right? And so if the government runs a deficit, are they a demander of borrowed funds or a supplier of funds? Demander. They're a demander, right? So the demand for loanable funds went up, causing the interest rate to go up. So interest rates climbed. And what did we call that when private sector investment shrinks? That was on your test last time, crowding out. That was the crowding out effect. So there's this interaction of government borrowing with private sector borrowing, and they're, at the end of the day, they're competing for funds. And so the government ends up getting some of those funds and has this crowding out effect. Okay, so that then plays into deficits and debts. Deficit versus debt is kind of what I want you to start off with today. What I just described was a deficit. What's the debt then? What is the national debt? Does anybody know how high it's getting? The national debt, the government debt? 13 trillion, yeah, something up higher. It kind of depends on which one we're measuring, but it's getting close to GDP. GDP is what per year, approximately? How much money do we make as Americans over the course of a year? The national income. 17 trillion in nominal terms, so 15 trillion in real terms, whatever. So somewhere in there, in other words, our national debt is getting close to being equal to the national income. All right, so is that a big deal or not? That's what we're going to talk about this chapter. So back to this question then, what is the deficit versus the debt? Deficit versus the debt. Becky?
Deficit would be what we're spending that's beyond what we're budgeted or our planned spending.
Okay.
And the debt would be what we owe borrowed funds.
You're dangerously close, but I want to talk about stock and flow variables and tie that in. So when you said the word spending when? What time frame?
Deficits for like a year.
Deficits for like a year.
And debt is the cumulative.
The accumulation of it. Good, right? So if we run a deficit for this year of, let me just kind of work through this a couple different ways. So if we run a deficit of $2,000, that means that G was greater than T by $2,000. Weapons of mass destruction, toilet paper for the White House was more than the sales taxes and income taxes and capital gains taxes, all the types of taxes. The spending by the government exceeded the tax collections of the government by $2,000 that year. So if that was 2008, then that would have been a miracle, but that would have been our deficit that year. Next year, if we are down $3,000, our deficit was $3,000, but now our debt is $5,000. That's right. So it's the accumulation of deficits. In terms of my bucket theory concept here, which doesn't work quite as nicely when we got negative numbers here, but I can express it as a positive. The debt level is the bucket, right? How much debt we have. If we have $16 trillion worth of debt, think of it as the level in the bucket at a point in time. Like right now we can jump on on Google and find the debt clock, and we can figure out today, right now, we owe $16 trillion, right? That's the debt. It has meaning at a point in time. It's the level of the bucket. each year we make decisions based on tax collections and government spending. We didn't have to buy that extra missile. We didn't have to buy that extra toilet paper for the White House, right? We made choices on the level of spending, and we also made choices on the tax rate and the different types of taxes that we collect. So over the course of the year, if there was a deficit, that's going to fill the debt bucket, and it's going to get higher and higher and higher. Now, there is potentially a hole in the bucket. What would cause this to go down? Paying off the debt. So debt payoff. Or if we were in surplus, where T is greater than G, we actually collected more taxes than what we spent, then we could be using part of that surplus to pay off the debt and to bring the debt water down. So here, this would be debt reduction in general terms. The reason I say it that way is because even if T is greater than G, sometimes the government doesn't put it towards the debt. They're like, oh, well, that extra money, we should put that towards education, of course, right? That's a no-brainer. Let's give it to the school system. Let's give it to these people. Let's give it to these people, right? And so all of a sudden they find ways to increase G rather than putting it towards debt reduction. So the funds have to be dedicated towards debt reduction in order to get the blue level. And then if we pay enough debt, then we might bring the debt level down. All right, so this is the flow. Anytime I have my faucet, the deficit is the flow variable. Same thing with the debt reduction, how much money we chose to pay off the debt. These are all flows, and the net effect of that is what has our water level going up or down. And so the level, the bucket level, the level is the stock variable. So the debt is a stock variable. The deficit and debt reduction are flows. Stock and flow variables, what we've kind of been doing all semester. We had the level of capital machinery and the amount of investment. Same thing going on. Okay, questions or comments there? So, deficit. Let's clear that up right now. So deficit is the amount by which government spending exceeds government receipts, parentheses, tax revenue. So in its purest form, I'd like you to go back to the way we described it before. Government savings is T minus G. And so this is receipts, tax receipts or tax revenue. So sometimes we generically call this receipts. Got that butchered receipts. Let's see, I before E, except after C. Right. So receipts, and this G is just like with cigarettes. That is our government spending. More generically, we can just think of outlays, what the government spent their money on, because spending could take the form of buying weapons of mass destruction. It could take the form of increasing welfare payments, right? Some sort of program, increasing unemployment claims. So basically, any outflow of cash is in this G category. When this government saving is negative, it's deficit. So that's kind of the note to add on here. Negative government savings implies there is a deficit. And I guess the one other thing I wanted to add on to this, amount by which spending exceeds government receipts in a year or some other time period, but generally we speak of it as a year. Okay, questions on that one? So the national debt is the accumulation of previous deficits. So it is the total amount of borrowings or borrowed funds at a point in time. Okay, let's look at some real numbers here. I think I'll go ahead and so here's the federal budget from 2011. Some actual numbers to sink our teeth into. So on the receipt side, we had personal income taxes. $1,076. These numbers are in billions, not thousands. And so 1,076 billion is, help me math people, 1 trillion, good. So $1 trillion worth of personal income taxes is what the government had in 2011. These were projections at the time we had this. Next category, Social Security tax. Wait a second, Social Security, that's a retirement fund. That's like you got 401k, you've got this, you got that. Why am I calling it a tax?
Because the people are taxed to supplement that.
Yes, it's a tax and transfer program, always has been since day one. Tax the young, transfer it to the old. There is no big retirement fund on Wall Street of that money. It's always been a tax and transfer system. So we're going to zap people another $1 trillion in Social Security. Corporate income taxes. Businesses are a legal entity that have to pay taxes as well. Was the way the system was structured. What do you think? Corporate taxes higher or lower than personal income taxes? Lower?
Higher.
Higher? You'd hope higher? 2 to 3 times higher or 5 times higher?
It's an interesting thing when I think about it because, I don't know, whenever I think about a business, I think about it as like the group of individuals and each owner of the business is having a personal income tax.
Okay,
how do you,
which is true.
how do you
Which
tax?
good. Maybe something sunk in with some of these. You were in micro too, so something's
Right.
sinking in with you. Good. We got
But how
a
do you-
group of people. So even though there's a legal entity, there's actually human beings that own the corporation, right? So
They're
good.
paying an income tax.
And so what you're alluding to is what's called the double taxation of corporations, or what really goes on is double taxing. Well, it turns out that you kind of think, and before I looked at this data, I had the perception anyway that businesses or big businesses would pay a lot more taxes. Turns out it's substantially less.
All right. Okay.
432 billion. So about less than half of what personal income taxes are. Now, Corbin hit on kind of part of the reason that is that what the corporation can pay taxes at the corporate level. So let's say Apple earned, $1 million, and then it turns around and it gets taxed on that million at the corporate income tax rate, which might be 15%. And so they pay taxes on that million, and if it was 15%, they're going to pay $150,000 from that, which gives them now $850,000 left of profit after tax at the corporate level. Now they can distribute that to the owners. And so all the owners, if Steve Jobs, even though he's dead, owned 10% of the company, if he owned 10% of the company, then he would have $85,000 of income, of profit, from the company, because he's an owner, a 10% owner, and now he would get zapped with personal income tax. But you see, that money was generated from the corporation. So effectively, the effective rate that corporations are paying is much higher than that first hit that they take here at this level, because it trickles down, and now the owner is taxed at the personal level up here. Okay, so it does end up being more, but that's the way the numbers shake out currently. So some people would argue we should eliminate the corporate income tax. Why do we have it? Because it probably felt good to a politician saying that it was an easy platform for them to run on to say, well, I'm going to implement a corporate tax to zap those evil businesses, when evil businesses are owned by evil people, I guess. So if an alternative would be to just
taxing the evil people.
Tax the evil people down here, right? We could maybe hit them down at this level. My point is that we start coming with questions of policy, like if we just need to collect X amount of revenue to pay for our weapons of mass destruction and toilet paper at the White House, we have choices, right? We could bump up the rate on high income individuals and make up the corporate income tax. That's the concept. So these are I'm just trying to get you thinking here about the policy decisions on what might be a good way to go versus other ways. All right, then the last category here is indirect taxes and kind of other miscellaneous. So there's like luxury taxes on imported Maseratis. I mentioned Maserati in the first. Who's somebody in here from, I don't know what, Maserati's on my head from this conference I was at. There was a Ferrari and Maserati showroom at the Wynn in Las Vegas, like in the hotel. And I got to admit, they're pretty sweet looking cars. But part of what the government does is charges a luxury tax. If you go buy one of those in the United States, you're going to pay a little more than buying a Chevy from somebody at the average Joe. So those sorts of things, alcohol taxes, stuff like that, extra little miscellaneous taxes, $245 billion. So if we add up all of this, we add up Social Security, corporate, indirect business taxes, we end up with $2.8 trillion, 2807. And again, these are all in billions. So we got $2.8 trillion is the T coming in for the government in 2011. That's our T over here. All right, questions or comments there? All right. So what's going on in the G side of life here? So on the G side, we've got transfer payments. Maybe I'll do this in blue just to make it stand out here. So transfer payments. Take from the rich, give to the poor. Take from the employed, give to the unemployed. Take from the young, give to the old, right? Reshuffling of dollars of bring the taxes in, redistribute them out to other people in some way, shape, or form. All transfer payments end up being $2.5 trillion, $2,588 billion is transfer payments. Next category, expenditure. So spending on goods and services. So, toilet paper at the White House, weapons of mass destruction, all that kind of stuff. Higher or lower than transfer payments? All that military spending, we got to fight off the bad guys over in Afghanistan, and got to be spending a lot more than all those programs. No. $1.1 trillion. $1,181 billion. Less than half of what we spend on redistribution efforts. So that's your national defense line that gets talked about a lot in the media. As a fraction of total spending, it's relatively small. All right, last category, debt interest. Debt interest. So we've really lumped these down, by the way, into spending. You know, you could spend all day looking at probably a spreadsheet that has, 5,000 line items, right down to toilet paper at the White House would be some, line item, right? So we really condensed this into lumping it into these three spots. So we got this $16 trillion of debt, depending on, again, how you're counting numbers. What is the interest on that? $360 billion. Relatively small again to the overall package. So debt interest is the smallest category, medium, big. We add up all of those funds and we get $4,129. Boy, it doesn't sound that big when I say 4,129 billion or 4.1 trillion dollars.
That sounds bigger.
Now, which one's bigger, G or T? G. To the tune of 1,322 trillion dollars is the deficit for 2011. 1,322 ends up being the deficit 1 year, $1.3 trillion, 1 year. George Bush started us off with hitting some big deficits. So it hasn't seemed to matter what party's in office. He started it off. Obama's continued the train right on. Yes, we've had tough times in the economy, blah, 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 blah. How much should we stimulate, right? We need to build new roads and bridges. We need to spend money on education. We need to do this. This will help the economy. Trust me. Well, the trust me part ends up running $1.3 trillion. Okay? There's a better chance you're going to pay a bigger share of that than me. So that's one of the issues that comes in terms of fairness, is we are juicing up the system here with stuff, and then I just had my parents visiting this weekend for Easter. They're 65. They're not going to have to pay it back too closely. They might hopefully live another 20 years, but my great-grandma, who is now 92 in a nursing home, she doesn't have to worry about paying back the $1.3 trillion, right? So we get into these, what's called, and it's in your chapter, generational transfers. generational transfers. We're spending money today. I get to enjoy it. You get to enjoy it. My parents get to enjoy it. My grandma gets to enjoy it. But who pays it back when debt was involved? Now that debt interest number is going to be higher after some people have croaked and the young people are still around. If the economy's strong, then hey, no big deal. And that's kind of the way it worked in the 2000s, right? We read or watched the video about the Americans getting drunk on debt. Like, woohoo, we can have a party. Oh, I got a great job. You kidding me? I'm working for a bank doing lending. I'm making 120 grand a year. I can take on some debt. I can buy a big house. I can buy a nice car. I can do this, right? And you run up that debt because, whoa, Jesus, it's a no-brainer. I'm making 150 grand a year. And then all of a sudden, job loss. Boom. And you're stuck with the debt. And now you got to figure out how to pay that back with your new $75,000 a year job. So now you got half the amount to pay it back. Governments around the world, the United States is no special case. Governments around the world are all doing this. Both private sector and government sector have been sucking on the punch bowl for a long time. And so a lot of this is coming to roost now within your lifetimes and should all be, if I can put a plug in here for the personal finance level, these should all be awesome examples of now when you're in your youth, do not go into consumer debt. Just avoid it. It's just a case of patience. Wait till you have the money, buy the thing later. Save your money, buy it later. Consumer debt is the biggest cause of divorce, too. So your life will be a lot easier if you don't drink from the punch. I heard a commercial for the car dealers, and you know how they're about as schmoozy as it gets in some cases. Some of them are real good. But this guy said, everybody come on down to Johnny Jew's car shop here. Everybody's running up their credit again, just like the good old days, and we're no exception. We can get you a 100% loan and get you driving off the lot today, right? All of that rhetoric is the problem. You, at a personal finance level, can avoid consumer debt. Just have a little bit of patience. A little bit of patience. And do it later, and you will thank me at some point if you actually take my advice on that today. All right. So the government, on the flip side, has an advantage over you that they have continued to exploit. When does the government die? When does the economy die, right? So for you guys, from a lifetime planning standpoint, if you live to the age you are now, which pretty much counts for anybody in this room, you're probably expected to live to 80-something now. As you get older and you've made it through infant mortality problems and some kids die off in the crib and all of that, you're going to be expected to live for another number of years. If you're a 20-something, you're talking 60-some years, right? You still have under your belt. So from a lifetime planning standpoint, you can say, oh, I can take on a little debt now and then I'll pay it off later. So what about the government and the economy? When do they die? It's different, right? The lifespan of the economy, the lifespan of the United States has no ending date. This makes it all the more tempting to take on debt. Because for you guys, you're like, oh, I can pay that off later when I'm, before I die and I'll be fine. I can kind of manage it that way. Well, here, the economy goes on in perpetuity. And so they could potentially have debts forever. Who got the best bite that they could chew? Who got the really tasty stuff? When we first started the first initial debt and we didn't have any debt interest, those people got a nice bite of the apple, right? But the government can continually, perpetually run a debt. And quite frankly, they probably will. We will probably not ever extinguish the debt, at least under current policy. We should, could, and hopefully will someday pull our heads out of our spots they shouldn't be and eliminate deficits. That's different, right? So if we eliminate a deficit and we get this thing so that some years we collect more T than G, and other years we spend more G than T, we kind of have this little balancing act on average, we could start to see deficits disappear. That has not been true in the United States for the last 30 years either. All right, let me pause there for a sec. This is a fun chapter, as you can see. All right, I'm going to show this part here. Let me see if I can get the screen down. Give you a little bit more data. So here's those numbers in a graphical form so that you can try to get about an idea. Now some of you can't see maybe all the way back, but you see this little guy here? This little blip on the radar back in 2000? It did happen once where T was greater than G. But otherwise, since 1980, all the way up, the blue is tax revenues. So at any given year, this was the tax revenue. And the top line is the amount of spending. And so the difference here in this red area is the deficit. And so now we start to see why we have a $16 trillion debt, is that we've been running deficits for a long, long time. Okay, questions or comments there? Here's how these have fluctuated over time. When we have the next presidential run, and we have some turnover in Congress coming up here this fall, policies change, right? So we might reduce or increase corporate income tax or personal income tax rates. And so this wiggles around over time depending on how the economy is doing and where they're getting their tax revenue from. Again, Social Security is a big part of that. Now, you might take comfort in saying, oh, it's so big, whew, lucky me. I should be fine at age 65 that there's that much of it. But the problem is there's not. We're getting down to that not being enough to support these baby boomers that are coming up. And so the number of working people that will be supporting the non-working people, the retired people, the math isn't working out. When they first started, it used to be 30 people, if I remember correctly, I'm kind of going off the top of my head, around 30 people for every one retiree. 30 supporting one. Now we're down to like 3 and 2 people supporting one. Remember, it's a tax and transfer program. So I take from the young and I give to the old. It's just a little revolving door. There used to be around 30 people supporting it, and that's the Social Security time bomb that we'll talk a little bit more about too. All right, so there's our breakdown of income. Any questions on that part? Here's the thing that I've taken a special interest in, trying to overhaul. Part of what I presented at this conference I went to when we didn't have class last week was trying to tackle this transfer business and maybe thinking of some alternative ways to where we could get the government out of the transfer business, because there's a big chunk of your money. It's approaching 60% now, so that every $100 of money that you pay the federal government, 60 of it is going towards transfer payments. And so part of what I tried to tackle was, is the government the best director of those funds? Back in the day, it used to be a lot smaller fraction. Now we're getting to be a serious fraction of the federal budget. And my question is the government in the best position to be directing those funds to the spots that they go? I think there might be some good alternatives. Spending on weapons of mass destruction and all of that, that's actually come down a little bit over time compared to the 80s. So when we start to have those budget decisions of what should we cut, what should we keep, this is the type of thing that is being grappled with in fiscal policy with Congress and the president. Okay, questions or comments on that one? In the past, the government owed mostly its own citizens. So when the government would run out of money and sell those government bonds, remember the $10 million, love Obama, right? Send that out. They would typically sell it to Americans. So it would actually be Americans that own it, and then we'd kind of be keeping it in-house. Something that's changed over the last 20 years has been the amount of debt owned by the rest of the world. China being right up there at the top in terms of how much debt they own. The $16 trillion number that we talked about is a little misleading in that we can carve out government-to-government borrowings. So part of that debt is that the federal government owes another arm of the government some money. And so it's like government owes the government. If you start canceling some of that out, we get down to some of these types of numbers that make it fall off a little bit more. And the one that economists have honed in on here is the amount held by the rest of the world. And so we've got this was 2010 numbers, that ratio is about the same. We've got $6 trillion worth of debt owned by China. Some people freak out about that. I tend to be one, well, who's really holding the cards here? If we don't pay back, in the old system, we weren't paying back our own people. Now, if we say, screw you, then we just go to war, and hopefully we've accumulated enough weapons of mass destruction that we can protect ourselves and defend ourselves. But we could wipe this out. Now, I do not want to see the government do that. I'd like to see them maintain their portfolio in the highest level. But this is a picture. These are some of the things that we'll talk about. So in the next class, we'll explore more on the breakdown of taxes and the types of taxes, and start to talk about your last project that we have on the fair tax proposal. We'll see you Wednesday.